Life and Labor in the Old South by Ulrich Phillips. Copyright 1929. Chapter 1. The Land of Dixie. Let us begin by discussing the weather, for that has been the chief agency in making the South distinctive. It fostered the cultivation of the staple crops, which promoted the plantation system, which brought the importation of Negroes, which not only gave rise to chattel slavery, but created a lasting race problem. This led to controversy and regional rivalry for power, which produced apprehensive reactions and culminated in a stroke for independence. Thus we have the house that Jack built, otherwise known for some years as the Confederate States of America. The South is nowhere tropical except at the tip of Florida, for it has winters with killing frosts. The characteristic feature is merely the length of the summers. The growing season lasts, on an average, 6 months at Baltimore, Louisville, and St. Louis, 7 at Norfolk, Atlanta, and Memphis, 8 at Columbia, Montgomery, and Dallas, and 9 at Charleston, New Orleans, and Galveston. The climate has fostered the cultivation of tobacco in the first zone, cotton in the second and third, and rice and sugarcane in the fourth. The summers are not merely long, but bakingly hot, with temperatures ranging rather steadily in the 80s and 90s of the Fahrenheit scale. In the droughts which occur at some time nearly every summer, when the sky is like brass and the ground is like iron, all shallow-rooted vegetation is parched. Thus the country in general is not well adapted to grass or to the small grains except rice, in which water is artificially supplied. The deficit of grass curtails cattle raising, and this restricts the supply of barnyard manure, and makes it hard to maintain the fertility of the fields. So, were it not for its own particular staples, the South would hardly prosper from agriculture in competition with the great grasslands of the world. Men must eat in the main what their land will yield. Rice is heavily consumed in its own district in sundry appetizing forms. Elsewhere, Indian corn is the chief cereal, always in its white varieties, for Southerners consider yellow corn unfit for human consumption. The green ear is roasted or boiled, or its grains cut off and fried to make into a pudding. The ripe grain is soaked in lye to make big hominy, or ground coarse into grits, or fine into meal, which is cooked in pone, hoe cake, spoon bread, muffins, and other toothsome preparations. Potatoes, in Southern parlance, are not the Irish variety, which ripen in weather too hot for storage, but the sweet ones, which mature in autumn, and roasted, fried, candied, or made into custard, rank second only to corn in Dixie diet. Peas, likewise, are not the English or garden variety, but the varicolored sorts, often called cow peas, which are planted in the cornfield when the corn is laid by and when served on the table, suggests the beans that Boston made famous. Apples do not prosper except on the mountain flanks, but peaches reach perfection in the hills and figs in the lowlands. Watermelon, if left on the vine till a thumping finger brings mellow response in the dew of the morning, or a straight arm pressure gives a crunch of sugary flesh, are just ready to melt in the mouth. Swine tended to be razorbacks, for they rooted for their living in the woods, and on occasion saved their lives by their speed. Keep your hogs lean, or the rogues will be fat, and a poor hog is better than no hog were proverbs with a point in the Black Belt. But this leanness gave an Epicurean result, as the Smithfield folk discovered. A slab-sided porker, quickly fattened and promptly slaughtered, yields hams beyond compare. A little invention converted a fault into a high virtue. Gastronomic resource is fostered by the climate to stimulate appetites which the hot weather makes languid. Indeed, most of the habits of life are affected. In the tedious heat, work is hard, indolence easy, speech is likely to be slow and somewhat slurred, manners are soft, and except when tempers are hot, the trend is toward easy-going practices, even among healthy people. But the climate has operated through the hookworm to make many half-invalid. Still further, whether in the very distant past or in more recent times, the climate has been responsible not only for the original forest covering of the land, but in a measure also for the quality of the soil. In even the coldest of the glacial ages, the sheet of ice which blanketed the northerly regions and, slowly moving, pulverized, transported, and intermixed the soils, encountered rays too strong and winds too warm to cross Mason and Dixon's line. The soil virtually everywhere is accordingly the product of rocks disintegrated on the very spot, or somewhere directly uphill or upstream. Most of the soils are thus mere sand and clay, in varying proportions, with little or no lime, and no humus, except perhaps on the surface. The lack of deep frost in winter and the consequent lack of mellowing thaw in spring leaves the ground hard-packed the year round. This diminishes the absorbent capacity of the clay, and by the same token shortens the beneficial influence of rains and heightens their deleterious effects. The southern rains seldom sifts, but commonly pelts from a great height, and by its pelting packs any plowed surface. Most of the rain in the characteristic downpours must accordingly run off. Great floods on the southern streams are on record from times when but little of the forest had been felled in their drainage basins. A sojourner in the Virginia lowlands remarked in 1686, "Never do these rivers become angry or leave their beds." But in June of 1771, a flood from the mountains destroyed the James River crops as far down as Westover, sweeping away houses, people, cattle, and some 4,000 hogsheads of tobacco from the landings. As an incident, at Ferrer's Island, which the highest freshet never before affected, above 80 acres of fine lands were rendered forever incapable of cultivation, the soil being gone, and in its stead 10 or 12 feet deep of sand, upon which there is a layer of stones, as if paved. The news report continues. Daily accounts are received of the loss of whole families, and houses come down with people floating on them, calling for help, though none can be afforded. On the whole, it is believed that history scarce affords an instance of equal damage being done to any country, if the destruction of land, loss of property, etc., be included. Such havoc was happily seldom, but the mere heavy rains of commonplace occurrence impaired the soils by leaching the flatlands and eroding the hills. Extending all the length of the seaboard lies a coastal plain, broadening to 200 miles in North Carolina, thrusting outward to form the whole Floridian peninsula, and reaching inward in the great embayment up the Mississippi River. With an elevation everywhere less than 300 feet, its gentle slopes are often imperceptible. With very little rock exposed, the main expanses are of deep sand. In some tracts, the seepage of rainwater has carried fine particles a few inches downward to fill the crevices between the grains, and packed a hard pan to check percolation and make ponds. These are exemplified in the Dismal Swamp and the Okefenokee. Here and there in other quarters, the clogging of a stream with driftwood strikingly illustrated by the Red River raft, heightened the water level, broadened the floodplain, and enlarged the swamps. The ponds, marshes, and swamps breed mosquitoes, which plague most of the good lands in the warm seasons. But most of the coastal plain suffers from excess rather of sand than of water. Great areas, particularly in the hinterlands of Wilmington, St. Augustine, and Pensacola, were in their natural state too sandy to support any vegetation except what was extremely frugal in its food requirements. Pine trees could prosper because their habitat is to hold their needles for several years instead of requiring new foliage annually. But the frugality of pines makes them very slow builders of soil, and on these excessively porous lands, their falling needles gave food only for pines again or for tough wiregrass. Pine forestation was, accordingly, an indication of poor soil, to be shunned as a rule by such settlers as could afford to discriminate in their locations. A persisting disesteem of these regions was embodied in their common designation as pine barrens. In sharp contrast to these are the alluvial strips and pockets which border the larger streams from the Potomac to the Rio Grande. On the Atlantic seaboard, the swirl of the tides has scattered the silt and mingled it with sand in some degree, but on the Gulf Coast the lack of tide has promoted concentration in deep alluvial deltas. Of these, by far the greatest is that of the Mississippi, which, having filled a former estuary from the mouth of the Ohio southward, now stretches its fingers of mud into the waters of the Gulf itself. The deltas have soils of high quality, but they are waterlogged in many portions. They are subject to annual overflow where not levied, and they are malarial where not drained. Not all the silt has remained where the water laid it. Some has been caught up by the winds and carried from the dried mudflats to settle again as dust on the adjacent hills and cover them with rich loess. Some of this occurs on the slopes of Arkansas and Louisiana, but the prevalence of westerly winds has laid it thickest on the eastward bluffs which border the floodplains from Memphis to Natchez, and fade into the lowlands at Baton Rouge. The richness of the loess, and likewise its distressing liability to erode, were noted by many observers. Stephen F. Austin wrote of the Natchez neighborhood in 1812, "The soil is very good and produces well for a few years, until washed away by the rain." 20 years afterward, J. H. Ingraham described the process in more detail. Every plow furrow becomes the bed of a rivulet after heavy rains. These uniting are increased into torrents, before which the impalpable soil dissolves like ice under a summer's sun. By degrees, acre after acre of what was a few years previous beautifully undulating ground presents a wild scene of frightful precipices and yawning chasms. Apart from the tracts which have received enrichment, whether by water or by wind, the coastal plain contains a few districts of marked fertility, the best of which lie upon limestone and are indebted to the peculiarity of this rock's weathering. The effect of rain upon it is rather to dissolve than to disintegrate. The seepage and runoff carry away most of the limestone proper, leaving its varied impurities behind, and it is these impurities, commonly rich in phosphates, which mainly constitute the resulting soil. But a residue of lime gives a cement promoting the retention of moisture against times of drought. Most notable of these favored areas are the so-called Alabama prairies, or Black Belt, lying in a tilted crescent from east of Montgomery to northwest of Tuscaloosa, and the Black Waxy Zone of Texas, extending from north of Dallas to south of Austin. Less pronounced in fertility, yet with enough clay to make sandy loam, are several other districts, among them the plain at large about Delaware and Chesapeake bays, a broad wedge on the Flint and Chattahoochee rivers extending south to Tallahassee, and the present rice-growing district about Crowley in the center of southern Louisiana. In all of these richer tracts, the forests which the pioneers found were mainly deciduous. Bays and gums, magnolia and live oaks, along with cypress, prevailed in the moisture belts of the lower South. Spanish moss draped the trees, and reeds and palmettos studded the ground below, all of which, despite their unsucculent appearance, gave browse for deer and cattle. On higher lands there were sundry sorts of oaks, along with hickories, chestnuts, walnuts, beeches, and poplars, and, toward Texas, pecans. The present-day prevalence of pines on the coastal plain of Virginia, and also in the Piedmont region, far and wide, has come as an unintended sequel of tillage, for the forests which the settlers cleared were mostly of hardwood. The clearing and cropping exhausted the shallow humus, and the land, where abandoned, was too lean for any trees but pines to gain footing. If left undisturbed by man, these would perhaps yield eventually to oak and hickory again, their seedlings drawing sustenance from the pine needle humus until their taproots reach depth and their laterals gain length, and the decay of their own falling leaves enriches the surface to feed of massive growth. Except for the tracts in Texas and western Louisiana, which were entered too late for full colonization by migrating slaveholders, all the more fertile portions of the coastal plain appear as districts of Negro majority in the population maps of 1860 and after, as an effect of the slave plantation system. The same is the case with such of the Piedmont zone as proved suitable for the production and marketing of staples in the period. The Piedmont and the Blue Ridge together comprise a region which anciently stood as a great island when adjacent land in all directions lay under the sea. The Piedmont soil is the fruit of crystalline rocks, largely granite, and is therefore mainly of clay and sand in varying proportions. Much of the clay has a bright red hue, and it is occasionally threaded with seams of quartz crystals. Rock crops out here and there, conspicuously in the granite dome of Stone Mountain in Georgia, and occasional fields are cumbered with loose fragments, but in the main the surface is free for tilth. The ground, though lean, contains enough plant-feeding minerals nearly everywhere to support a hardwood forest. But no white man ever saw the land in utterly virgin state, for here, as in many other quarters, the Indians before them had wrought considerable changes in the vegetation. Not only had they made petty clearings for tillage, leaving weedy, old fields, but by fire they had modified the forests far and wide. Some of the flames no doubt spread unawares from campfires. Others were purposefully set, whether to concentrate game in a narrowing circle for slaughter, or to remove undergrowth and promote fresh herbage to attract game in future seasons. The effects were diverse. In some places, perhaps where fires occurred in time of drought, all the trees were killed, and the land was converted into prairie, covered with grass, wild pea vines, or canebrake, all of these furnishing pasturage. But more generally the result was a mere thinning of the forest by the killing of young growth, giving the greater trees more room in which to attain yet greater size. The litter beneath the hard woods rotted into forest mold, but the long summers made this decompose into thin, ashy stuff more speedily than in cooler climes. Thin as they were, the mold and the litter were good as gold to the pioneers, who let in the sun by deadening the trees, seeding their crops and reaped with comparative abundance. But except for seldom level spaces, the surface of the Piedmont is rolling, gently along its lower edge, heavily in the middle zone, and ruggedly near the mountains. With the ground kept bare by cultivation, every sloping field suffered erosion, and the rich topsoil was first to go. The rivers ever since have been clouded, even in dry weather, and bright brick red in time of flood. A Texan, telling of his neighbor's troubles in 1855, said that they had the same defect of title which had been complained of by a Georgian many years before, which defect consisted in his title not being sufficient to hold his soil, as every hard rain carried much of it into the branches, creeks, and rivers, entirely out of reach of recovery. Much of the Piedmont, in fact, erodes with a facility comparable to that of the Natchez loess. As an example, Sir Charles Lyell described in 1846 a gully near Milledgeville in central Georgia, which from an origin less than 20 years before had then attained a depth exceeding 50 feet, a length of near 1,000, and a breadth approaching 200. When I last visited this chasm, 80 years after Lyell, its length and breadth had perhaps doubled. But great pines had fallen into the caving banks, taken root afresh with trunks aslant at strange angles, and were holding the floor at a fairly permanent slope. The gully's head is now so near the hill crest that its advance is slackened, and its threat of engulfing the lonely grave of a Revolutionary veteran and a slab placed thereon by the state may not be accomplished for several score years to come. Above the Piedmont looms the Blue Ridge, so named from its look of its deep green forests when seen through the hazy distance. This range festoons the map from Pennsylvania to Georgia, with its main mass filling the western part of North Carolina. Its ancient crystalline rocks appear in some places in towering cliffs, as at Caesar's Head, which looks out upon South Carolina. But commonly the stone is covered with earth, or at least hidden by the trees, which have gained prosperous footing. The valleys along the winding streams were proved by settlers to have soil as good as the Piedmont, but quite as prone to lose it by erosion. Throughout the great length of its northwest face, the Blue Ridge drops abruptly along a great fault in the crust of the earth. All the great region beyond was once and for long the bed of the sea. But through geologic ages, the surface was lifted into a plateau, and its hither edge crumpled so slowly that the crisscrossing rivers were able to cut through the rising stone and hold their courses. Frost and flowing water have long since disintegrated and carried away the crust of shale and sandstone from the parallel ridges and cut into the limestone beds beneath. Thereby, the zone has become a continuous corrugated valley, some 40 miles wide and so long that it has no single name. For a space it is called the Shenandoah, and for another distant space the Valley of East Tennessee. But in the intervening stretches where it is drained by the James, the Kanawha, and the New Rivers, it is merely known as the Valley, for in that region no other name is thought to be needed. Its hill-studded floor lies too high to have a climate suited to the southern staples, but for grass and grain it excels every other southern region except the Kentucky and Nashville basins. Facing the Blue Ridge, across the span of the valley, is the slightly curving wall of the Allegheny or Cumberland escarpment, beyond which the plateau, deeply scored by winding streams, slopes downward to the northwest. The lean soil and rugged contour have made it wretched for tillage, except in isolated coves and on remaining bits of level upland. It took sturdy philosophizing for a settler to write in 1798, I here hazard a conjecture that has often occurred to me since I inhabited this place, that nature has designed this part of the world as a peaceable retreat for some of her favorite children, where pure morals will be preserved by separating them from other societies at so respectful a distance by ridges of mountains, and I sincerely wish time may prove my conjecture rational and true. Beyond the Mississippi, the Ozarks repeat, in large degree, the features and influences of the Alleghanies. In both of these dissected plateaus, the primitive regime persisted until the latter-day invasion of logging and mining corporations. Long spurs of the Cumberland Plateau carry the lean hills far westward in southern Kentucky and southern Tennessee to set apart from one another three limestone basins: the Kentucky Bluegrass, the Nashville District, and the Tennessee River Valley in northern Alabama. The praise of these must await a later singing, except for a single phrase. A full century ago, they were saying in the Bluegrass that heaven could only be another Kentucky, and they are saying it yet. But not even the Bluegrass was at first glance manifestly destined to the rearing of thoroughbred horses and thoroughbred folk. The capabilities of every part of the far-flung southern land, plains and hills, mountains and valleys, had to be learned through the painful process of trial and error.